I'm always sort of conscious of culture and language before I talk about technology, because I will a bit. Who's kind of really mainly sourcing? So sourcing, and who's got a technology background? Oh, so quite a few. So that's pretty good. I spent a year in Japan, and as part of preparing for that, I went to a place at Farnham Castle where they talk about culture. And preparing you to go into expat land. One of the interesting things was the way that people give feedback on presentations. Japanese are very, sort of specific, so they rate it from, bad to very good. So bad, poor, average, good, very good. Whereas if you talk to people in Britain, then if it's bad, then they say it's very informative. And if it's poor, then they might say it's very interesting. And if it's average, then they'll say it's okay. And if it was good, they'll say it's not bad. And if it was great, they'll say that's not bad at all. So when I get your feedback, I'll know that if you say it's very informative, exactly where I stand. Interesting what Bill was saying about location, because I am independent, doing some quite interesting different things. And one of the organizations I'm working with is split between Ukraine and Poland as a provider of outsourced offshore services. I'm not making a pitch for it, so I won't tell you who they are. But it's a very different model in terms of the capability, its location, the way that it can nearshore, onshore, and offshore capability, and providing some real competition to the traditional Indian organizations, and I've worked with most of the large providers. So I'm going to talk about IT sourcing, and that's why I wanted to just sort of make that point to start. It is a minefield. It's getting more complex. At this point in time, one of the big issues that I've seen over the years is that sourcing strategy tends to be done as part of the overall IT strategy. It's not explicit enough in the way that it comes across, and therefore some of the stakeholder engagement and management doesn't necessarily really understand what they're going to get as a consequence. Agility, speed to market. I was talking to an ex-colleague of mine who's an executive in a large insurer that I used to work with. And he said the real problem they've got with their capability at this point in time is they need to make change to their web services, their digital content, generally every day. The way they put in place their existing commercial arrangement, which is what they want some help with, is that they're capable of delivering a release every 3 months. So from a competitive advantage perspective, agility and speed to market is one of the critical things that's now driving a change in the way that IT providers are looking at provisioning their services, because they don't fundamentally meet today's model. They don't meet the capability. But of course, part of that is because of the way that a lot of those services were set up, which has put a big risk factor into the service providers, which makes them very risk averse in terms of saying, until I've been through X, Y, Z cycles of testing, I'm not prepared to go live. So as a consequence, this insurer has been out, employed 20 or 30 Drupal developers to do it for themselves, with the sort of conflict that you get as a consequence. So a lot of what I find is with, sourcing strategy is great, but it can't be done in isolation. The critical thing is how you execute it. It's how you deal with, putting the right program in place with all of the right plans and metrics, communication, stakeholder engagement to actually make it work. And one of the big factors in program management is understanding what the target operating model looks like in terms of how you're going to put these services in place and execute them effectively as you go through delivery and transition and live running. And that's the thing that a lot of people forget. They think, once you've done the deal, the deal's done. So I'm going to cover a number of areas around that with one or two examples of how you deal with some of these issues in terms of IT outsourcing. Just a bit of context for me. And by the way, I don't mind taking questions as we go, but it'd be probably easier to do it at the end so we know how much time we've got left. One of the reasons IT outsourcing fails is that it starts late. as have I. But let me just start with this simple tower structure. So if you look at IT sourcing, this is what it covers. Desktop, network, telephony, hosting, a range of application support, maintenance and delivery, and how you then integrate that and manage it across the enterprise. Yeah. And increasingly more organizations are moving to this form of model as opposed to the mega deal of one supplier to deliver outcomes. And the main reason being that one mega supplier can't do everything. So even when you look at public sector or insurance, when they went for those mega deals, actually all you ended up with was they had a whole bunch of subcontractors that were delivering these components underneath. The big issue that you've got with that is just that the client, the customer, doesn't get to talk to the subcontractors. It always has to be done through the organization, the service provider that did the mega deal. And that can be really difficult when you're looking at whether or not these things are fit for purpose, particularly after you get over the first hurdle, and what you've got is someone turning around, today and saying, yeah, I'd like to be able to connect my iPhone or my iPad to your email system. If you haven't got direct access to understand why you can't do that, then all you get is a disgruntled employee. And if the disgruntled employee happens to be the chief executive, then you've got a service contract that's not working. If it's just somebody else on the ground floor, it's a service contract that could be made to work more effectively, maybe. So the critical thing is, trying to keep it simple, but the real challenge today is that people are moving to something, as Bill said and others, that is looking at more silo, niche provider capability around specific expertise. The other thing that's going on is technology's evolved, so the model becomes less simple. I wonder whether we're keeping stakeholders happy. We used to refer to it as the airline magazine, the place where chief executives and finance officers used to read about the latest technology and then go back to their CIO and say, why haven't I got one of these? The difficulty is it's more pervasive now, because instead of being on an airline magazine, it tends to be in emails, in social media, and it's in your face all the time. So cloud capability, unified communication, bring your own device, means that you're starting to see organizations moving towards utilizing these, but a lot of it is pushed by our friendly suppliers, which helps them to move forward in terms of their technology capability and to ultimately make more money, which is, let's face it, that's what the suppliers, the service providers are in it for. They're in it to make profit. So we do tend to make it a little bit harder than it maybe was in the past. So when you take those different options in place, you end up turning that simple tower structure into something more complex. So you split your desktop between, what you would normally see on your desk, coupled with, we talked about Microsoft, 365, in the cloud, and also able to access it through any device that you may allow your employee to bring and use in the office. And that's not a bad thing, it just means you've got more interfaces to deal with. You've got more supplier separation, which means it's harder to identify who's accountable for it when it goes wrong. Right? So that's the critical challenge. So as you start to make it more complex and you have niche providers, that's great because you can get better capability. But what you also find is it means you've got more suppliers to deal with, and you've got to deal with what I refer to later as the religious wars. Yeah, it's my service. One of the things that I did in insurance was to set up an innovation capability with IBM and BT. It gave us access to the research capability in Martlesham and also to the IBM labs in Zurich. It was great, and we had a governance structure which included the insurance company's CEO, one from IBM, and the way that we would look at innovation. Unfortunately, most supplier innovation seems to consist of eating other suppliers' dinner. Right? So I can give you this great thing if only you'd let me take over that service because it's not very good. So there is a big challenge around how you make the most of some of the things that you need. And it's understanding, where does your sourcing strategy sit? What are you looking to get from it? in terms of outcome and value, and I'm not sure that we always understand what that looks like. So, which stakeholders do you keep happy? If you sort of look at what I've kind of drawn here, so you've got to deal with a CEO from a strategic perspective, a CFO from a finance perspective, a CEO from an operational delivery perspective, a chief people officer. I could have, used HR, but, so what are the people getting? And it's a big dimension, particularly for organizations with a large administration function, as you tend to get in insurance, financial services, banking, and the public sector, which I know. Chief Risk Officer, is it going to comply? Is it going to make my life more difficult? Is it going to allow me to meet the requirements of the FCA or whichever regulatory body you're dealing with? And a Chief Marketing Officer, which increasingly today is taking over the role of Chief Digital Officer in terms of digitising capability. So you end up with something that says, right, so we're looking for value for money. So that's one of the drivers for your sourcing strategy. And we're looking for cost savings. So I'm expecting to get something for less money for the same service quality as I have today. Right? So that's a challenge, value for money and cost savings. Then I'm looking for better service levels. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer. I want better service levels. So I want my employees to be more effective in the way they use technology to do their job and my customers to be more satisfied with what I give them. Then I'm looking at the right size and skilled organization and the retained organization, to the point that was made earlier about how much of your IT organization do you need to retain to run and control this. And then I went best practice. So I'm looking to a global provider of services to give me their best practice. Bill mentioned the IT infrastructure library as a standard for best practice, but it's only one. But your Chief Risk Officer will look at, am I getting best practice from your global experience, IBM, HP, Accenture, Capgemini, etc., that means that I can leverage that into my organization? And do I get innovation in terms of driving new business models through digitization? And that's the problem that you've got with sourcing, is that largely you can't keep all of those people happy and achieve all of those outcomes. They need to be ranked. You need to have some means. So the next big thing I'd look at, have a contingency plan, have a specific sourcing strategy that sits outside your IT strategy, and then have something that allows you to weight, and I bet weight in terms of weight, the different outcomes that you want to achieve, so that people are clear that, yes, you are looking to get best practice, but actually we've agreed that value for money and cost savings at this point in time in our cycle is more important. One of the things that, I just put this one up. One of the things that we looked at quite closely was one of the value structures around having different tower structures to deliver sourcing options. And the reason for doing this is most businesses and most business executives don't understand the cost of running a procurement and then implementing it and making it run effectively. It's a big change. It's a programmatic change that you need to understand. And if you start at the beginning and say, right, where's my value proposition? The second thing you look at is, what's my target operating model? And is it different to the one that I've got at the moment? If you're doing a like-for-like commodity swap, that's easy. But if you're doing something that fundamentally changes the way that you go about buying and using services, then you've got to think about, how long do these things take, both in the boiling and then in the serving? So in terms of getting to a deal and then in delivering the deal and making it work effectively. So you need to be able to understand what your internal capability is, how much you've got of it, and where you're going to focus its attention. Otherwise, one of the things that you end up with, and the third big deal I did with DWP required an internal team of 240 people, of which 2/3 of that were interims and contractors, to deliver a complete infrastructure refresh. And if you don't understand that, and then the consequential impact on the business, is one of the things that means your outsourcing will fail, because people won't understand how to use it, and they won't understand where the value comes from. Now here's the kicker, really, deal makers and breakers. So whatever process you go through, RFI, RFP, ITT, ITFT, whether you go through an OJU process, restricted competition or whatever, you will get to a point where you've got a best and final offer coming onto the table and you've got a deal to make. Now, the issue that you've got when you get to that point quite often is that there's a very small number of people that really understand the deal from both a supplier perspective and from the customer perspective. Very small number of people. And one of the reasons why IT outsourcing isn't changing is because a lot of the supplier mentality is still the same. So what you end up with is something that happens. So there's a small number of people that know the deal, and then the typical supplier reaction to that. So you've done it, it's really sharp, it hits a hurdle rate of return of, say, 8%, but they're used to getting 12 or 14. So what you get then is the owner of the P&L account who's delivering the outcome for that supplier does what he always or she always does, which is they try and increase the margin. They try and increase the scope. They try to cut down on the quality, and they try to cut down on their third-party costs. And they have a number of different tactics for doing this. What you therefore need to have is a direct and opposite capability in your organization that's doing the same, but in the opposite direction. To understand what tactics they're using, how they're using them, and what you can do to say, no, I want to keep the scope as we agreed it. I want the service level to be as we said. The cost will be the cost that we agreed, either in terms of operational running or in terms of delivery and transition. And the quality is the quality level that we agreed as part of the contract, but more importantly, as part of the program of implementing this capability. The issue around post-deal, so there's a whole bunch of different pressures to deal with. And I'm only going to touch on one or two, because I know that Bill and others touched on, you get the B or the C team. They promise the earth, they promise you the A team, you get the B or the C team. Yeah, they deal with augmentation of their resource capability offshore. So you start to get much lower cost resources, not necessarily lower skilled, with a communication gap in terms of delivering the outcome. Bespoke development and IPR lock-in. Let me just relate a lesson to you that we learned the hard way, just in case it ever comes up. So, if you're dealing with a global supplier, quite often they will use a leverage capability as part of delivering the deal. So they will use something they already have to deliver an outcome for you. When we recompeted a desktop within the public sector, it's predicating on being able to use a component called an Active Directory. So this is a thing that records who people are, what they've got, where they are, what access they have to what services, etc. But they create a bespoke capability which was part of their leverage delivery to multiple clients. When an alternate supplier won the desktop deal, that existing incumbent wouldn't release the IPR. And that meant they'd have to recreate it as part of the transition, which cost 12 months delay in terms of delivery, and therefore, as a consequence, the IT outsource failed. But it wasn't the IT outsource failed, it was something within the way the program had been constructed that didn't understand one of the key risks that you had to deal with. Following that, one of the things that we went about doing, which I'd recommend people do, is understand whether or not there is any critical IPR contained in any of the services that you've outsourced that you would need to exit them and move it on to another supplier, so that you have the control of that IPR going forwards, either exclusively or to be able to be used by any future supplier to deliver that service. Because if you haven't, then you've got a problem. You get an IPR lock-in. 2P management, scope creep, these are issues. I talk about one other before I move on, because I'm just conscious of the time. One here I call managing the zoo or the jungle. And it was an analogy that my commercial director used to use around, how much do you want to actually get this new supplier to take on? I was going to use Capita as an example, but I won't. I use Serco because they're not here. But what you end up with is the days of Serco taking on a BPO capability was because they knew that it was being run pretty badly. So whatever they bid, they knew that they could take it on, run it, and make a pretty hefty profit as a consequence once they turned it around, improved the process, improved the technology, et cetera, et cetera. That was the critical thing. So what we look at in terms of some of the aspects of what do you outsource and what you don't is the zoo is the set of animals that you know and you love and you water and you feed them every day and you know how much size and space they take up and you know how much stuff you need to keep them healthy. That's the stuff you outsource. The jungle, which is the stuff you really don't understand well, the application you don't have the source code for, the end user computing applications that you have spread around, often called shadow IT, is the stuff that you don't necessarily go for until you understand it. Because the issue you've got is that once the supplier's in and they start to try to manage the jungle, you can't control scope creep. It's really hard because you've actually got no control of it before you outsource it. So it's a really important lesson that we went through to understand how not to do it well. Just on what I call the religious wars, something that's really important to understand is whose line is it? So being clear on the operating model and the architecture of the way you go about delivering the services, really important to understand so you don't get into the religious debate after you've delivered. Bring your own device, or Blackberries if people use them, are a good example where we got into a debate between is a Blackberry a desktop or is it a network attached device and a mobile phone? Because what the suppliers wanted was control of access and provision of service and wanted to align it with their particular service tower. So the critical thing, and I wouldn't go into all of these, is putting in place a defined strategy and architecture around the components of the service you're going to deliver, putting in place a defined operating model with clear responsibilities and accountabilities in the client and in the supplier in each instance, some standards that Bill mentioned a while ago. If you've got a multi-supplier arrangement, something like operating level agreements. So you won't get necessarily a commercial relationship between two suppliers that are delivering services to you that have mutual dependencies, but you can put in place an operating level agreement that says this is what you have to do to work together well, and a three-layer governance model that enables you to make sure that you have a chief executive level conversation to have, that you've got a day-to-day management of the contract and the service conversation going on, and a third level, which is about how you actually buy and exploit the service as you go forwards. The thing that I'd also suggest is around ways of working. So, you know, critical thing is about culture. If you get a supplier or service provider on board that has a different culture, you have a real problem in terms of whether or not they can work with you and you can work with them. And one of the things, in addition to operating level agreements, is something that we used to call the three musketeers, depending on how many service providers you have. But it was focused primarily on saying, if you get into a problem, let's fix it first and argue later. So let's deal with the consequence of whatever's gone wrong, irrespective of who thinks it's whose fault. Work together, fix it first, then let's deal with the arbitration and discussion about cost later on, because otherwise it's your business that fails. You know, it's the service to your customers that fails. I'm not going to talk about that. We're sort of a bit short on time. Demand supply governance model is really important. The only point I'd make is quite typically these blocks aren't connected. And one of the things that I've seen that makes IT outsourcing fail is not having the control of these things close enough to the people that actually deliver the service. So they've actually got levers to understand how they're going to deliver the benefits, and the benefits are about delivering those value streams that you agreed up front in the program. If you haven't got the benefit owners owning the means of delivering these things, then fundamentally you've got a broken model. If they see that it's a commercial team that's managing the contract and they're dealing with these issues that seem to be contractual, and a service delivery team that's managing these elements of service, and the two aren't joined together, you've got a broken operating model which will cause you a real problem in terms of what happens. In terms of the religious wars, I use this kind of model in terms of strategy and architecture, something that really clearly defines where the technology policies sit in terms of your relationship with the supplier. Supplier is there to deal with the delivery of the physical capability to deliver the service. The client side has to have the ability to define strategy and conceptual and logical architecture. And if you don't have that capability, whether it's IT outsourcing or other types, then you struggle because you can't understand sufficiently how the components fit together and work. And one of the last things I just talk about is the, oh, is that what you meant? You know, so dealing with diverse stakeholders, so not just the value map, but then what they're going to get as a consequence is, do they really understand what they've signed up to? And some use case or test cases that allow you to make sure that they really do. Yeah, I didn't realize I couldn't use my iPhone for email. I didn't realize I can't use MS Project on my iPad. Oh, I didn't realize I'm an employee. I don't get a pay slip anymore from my shared service. It's online or a P60. And we have to do our own expenses now online if we want to get paid. All these things that actually create a consequential noise around an organization creates a problem that if it gets to the wrong level of noise, means that your IT outsource and other types of service outsource will fail. So an explicit communication plan around what this means in day-to-day operational terms helps enormously in making that work effectively. Last slide before I finish. There's so many things that you can do about KPIs and metrics on contracts. And the critical thing I say is, yeah, you can use them in sort of detailed discussion, but you need to make sure they're focused on value for money, cost savings, improved services, innovation, and skills. Because without it, you don't really have metrics that make a difference to the business. They're metrics that just make a difference to you, who's managing the service provider, and the service provider themselves. You know, my network is always up. It's 100% up all the time, and yet I've got a part of my organization that can't access any applications. That means nothing to the business. And a CIO that goes in and says, this service tower's green, aren't we doing a great job, is doomed to failure if what you haven't got is end-to-end business capability being available to people. And just a question, does anyone here use benchmarking? Yeah, benchmarking? No? That's good, because I'd probably say don't bother. Mainly because the application of benchmarking at the point that you come to do it usually is so expensive that people just trade it off against a discount on services. Because it's easier. You know, you get some of the outcome, maybe not as much as you might if you force a supplier to be in the top quartile, if that's where you agree they should be, but most people just trade benchmarking off as actually we put it in the contract just in case. So, summary. These are the 10 things that I would look at. Treat it as a program, and if you've got multiple towers to deal with and therefore multiple suppliers, I'd keep the program running because you need the capability for the long term. If you lose it, you've got to recreate it again. Line up your IT sourcing strategy alongside IT and business strategy and refresh them on the same timeline. Don't do them out of sync because otherwise you're in a situation where the business won't see that they're getting the value they expect from the service providers. Be clear what the value drivers are. Plan for a new target operating model, because unless you're just swapping in a commodity, then fundamentally someone's job is going to change because you're doing something different with a different supplier. Establish a risk and issue management process and a contingency plan. Recognize the midpoint is signing the deal, not the end point. Some people forget that. Great, I've signed the deal, off we go. It's actually the rest of it that's the hard bit. Cultural fit is really important, which is why it's quite hard for UK organisations, and particularly when I sort of look at my background in the public sector, to work effectively with offshore, not necessarily Indian operations, but any offshore capability, because the culture is different, in terms of delivery. Get the ways of working to work effectively. So at least you've got multiple suppliers, get them to agree on, the outcome of the business is most important, not arguing about the contract and whose fault it might be. Governance has to be real, so make sure the metrics that you use for governance is about delivering business value, and put the ownership of managing suppliers as close to delivery as you can, so that it's not seen as an ivory tower that doesn't understand how the business really operates. And that's kind of me done. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you. Next question.
Malcolm, you talked about and builded about moving away from big system integrators, but across those towers now, as you're getting several outsourcing agreements, who's managing the integration between those? So desktop to network, obvious ones where you've got to work collaboratively, potentially between two suppliers.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean that's what the SIAM layer, so the service integration and management layer, is there to do. So ideally having, and the way that you see organisations splitting it is between a retained organisation is part of the service integration and management layer, and largely would be the demand side of the equation, and then you would contract a SIAM provider to be the integrator across those services, and that would be the supply side of the equation. But you have to have a, really quite strong strategy, architecture, governance around making that work effectively, so that what you're not doing is kind of hiding what used to be a mega deal and having one size for everything and one supplier for everything, into, well, I've now got another layer that's stopping me from getting at the detail of who's in those other towers, and it's really important to understand that risk.
And you advocating that SIAM layer is taken back in-house?
Largely, yes. Yeah. Because that really is your point of management and control, but you've got to have the skills and capability to run it. ITIL and COBIT and stuff like that can help enormously, but you need to find the people with those skills.
Keeping stakeholders happy. I'm interested to hear. Who did you spend most of your time keeping happy? Two
sets of people. Ministers, because they're really worried about the political aspects of stuff, and Cabinet Office, which kind of comes down to another minister because it's Francis Maud.
And in the non-public sector?
Then what you're really looking at is a combination of, the finance guys and the operations guys. So, CFO or finance director, whatever you want to call him or her, and the operations. Because if you can get the numbers to work and you get the service quality to work, those deal with a big chunk of the issues.
Talking again about the stakeholders, the question of, first of all, I'm wondering why it was a surprise that the jobs shouldn't stay in the UK. I mean, I'm talking not as someone in this profession, I'm talking about the average public, that has issues about those things. Yeah. And that's obviously a stakeholder question when it's public sector. So that's the first part of a two-part question. Second part is, when you had to go to your secondary solution, which may turn out to be now offshore in a few more months. Well. What were the differences in that? In other words, were there cost differences that you measured? Were there things capabilities that had to be created? I mean, what did it look like when you had to move to that second solution?
So two things then. One, the principle of offshoring was agreed at minister level some way before we got to that point. It was only when we got to the very specific that said, but these are, people that appear to now be being made redundant and jobs be moved offshore. The reality is we're protecting the capability because most of the people were aged somewhere between 55 and 60 and would get a very good deal as a consequence of moving on, but there's a number of them that wouldn't. So you end up in a situation that says the principle of offshoring as a means of delivering CMMI level 5, higher quality capability at a much lower cost, was agreed. It's when you get to the specifics that it becomes really difficult. If no one from those stupid people in the organisation had not written the letters, it would have just carried on. So it wasn't kind of a surprise, it was a risk to be managed. On the other hand, then, where we got to was a good outcome because we put it in Greenock and we created a recruited graduate-based capability to do application support in a purpose-built environment. It was bringing jobs into that part of the economy, and the aging workforce was still made redundant or early retirement or whatever. It's just that they happened to be in Scotland. The cost differential was only largely in terms of the wage, the wage differences and on costs. The 7 is about 3 million a year.
Because we talk a lot about the percentages between moving something here, there, and everywhere. I'm just trying to get a rough idea.
Let me grab you when we have a coffee, and I'll tell you. I'm just trying to, and if I sort of make it up on the fly without getting it right. But I know the difference in terms of the cost reduction was about 3 million. So we lost 3 million in benefits per year as a consequence of not going to India. So this wasn't a massive amount of people, but the issue was because India made it a lot easier to do 24/7. UK is not easy to do 24 hours a day support. Yeah, it's more expensive, much more expensive.
One more.
Malcolm, thanks. That's a tour de force. Just one comment on the difference, I think, between public and private sector, and we've sort of touched on it there. And it really is around stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
That is the fundamental difference that I've found in working in public and private sector. It is just so much more complicated in public sector.
It is.
And people don't give enough credit to that, I think.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the pace of change in public sector. People don't credit that, but actually it is huge.
It is. Absolutely. Thanks, Bob.
I think we'll draw the line there. A big thank you to Malcolm. Ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm Whitehouse.
Fantastic.